welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this is the Tuesday following Colossal Con. So both of us are exhausted and at least somewhat sick. So if we sound feeble or just off or anything like that, I want to apologize right here and right now.
I'm pretty sure I was patient zero for the con flu at Colossal this year because while I was driving down, I sneezed and felt my throat start to itch and get sore, and I was like, well, this is how it's gonna be, huh? So if you got sick at Colossal, there's a high chance that I was the one who gave you that cold.
We would like to take this moment to apologize to the entirety of Colossal Con, and indeed the entirety of Sandusky, for the havoc that Jackson has wrought. We apologize. But no, down to brass tacks, we're talking about Incredibles this week. This is the second Brad Bird movie we're doing in under a month, and I'm okay with that. I might not necessarily agree with all of his politics that are very apparent in this movie, and you better believe we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about that. But I think he's a fantastic filmmaker. Bearing in mind as well that I also have not seen Tomorrowland, which I have heard is a disaster. That said, I know some people that very much love it.
I have seen Tomorrowland, and at the time when I watched it, I thought of it as just kind of another mediocre sci-fi movie. Because, I don't know, when would that have come out? 2012, 2013, something like that?
Somewhere in that vicinity. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and that was when I was going to the movies every week. So I don't know how much it registered on my radar. I don't remember it being particularly good. Not speaking too much on behalf of Tomorrowland. Speaking solely of The Incredibles, I have to say that this is probably peak Brad Bird in that it is an excellent showcase for his talents as a filmmaker. It is well crafted, well directed, well written, very much enjoyable, very great. But it is also the sort of pinnacle, well, Tomorrowland's probably the pinnacle, but a very good example of kind of those hang-ups, his politics, his preferred aesthetics, for good or for ill. So even though we're going to be doing a deep dive into the politics of this movie, I wanted to clarify something real quick, because the conversation might sound a little overly critical, maybe more critical of the movie than, I don't want to say that I intend to be, because it's not like I'm sitting here trying to make things up, but maybe will give the impression that I don't think the movie is great, and I do. It's charming, it's super fun, it's got a lot of great action sequences, it's got a lot of great character dynamics, the aesthetics are super memorable, and the stylized, really great character designs help do a lot to sort of combat kind of how the CGI has aged a little bit and keep the movie still fun to watch. So The Incredibles is great, but it's also, shall we say, problematic.
Yeah, it's I definitely am gonna echo your sentiment there. This is definitely one of my favorite movies. Definitely, probably my favorite superhero movie. Just because everyone in it, all the characters are just a lot of fun to watch, to see them interact with each other. There's some very, very good jokes. The scene where Dash runs on water is just fucking the greatest scene ever. His laugh is perfect to this day. It's so fucking good. But yeah, there's definitely some political sides of things that I don't necessarily agree with, and as we're going to kind of talk about, seem to be a little at odds with each other, and also plays into the themes of death. So, we actually are going to tie this one back into the theme of the podcast.
It doesn't always happen, but this time I think we got some real solid footing to stand on.
So yeah, let's dive into spoilers. and talk about The Incredibles. And I'm actually going to let Jackson start us off here because he can talk about this better than I can.
So, in case you're unfamiliar, I guess we'll start with just kind of, we've been alluding to politics here, and just referring to them in vague terms. But let's get down to brass tacks and say exactly what we mean here. If you have seen any sort of internet writing on Brad Bird or The Incredibles, and I say any just because this is not a new observation or an uncommon or unpopular one, then you may have noticed that the film's themes, a lot of its dialogue, the way its character arcs end up playing out, pretty closely to the ideals of objectivism and Ayn Rand. And if you're not familiar with her philosophies, we talked a little bit about this in the Iron Giant episode because, again, Brad Bird, but just in case you didn't watch that one, that's basically extreme right-wing, altruism is a lie. Only the strong and the smart should be allowed to escalate in society based on their merits, and they should basically rule over the lesser sheep. And that's maybe a simplification. I don't know if it's that much of a simplification, considering Ayn Rand. But yeah, that's if you are an objectivist, I apologize if I misrepresented you. But that's sort of the basis for the general train of thought for what we're going with here. And you can see how in superhero movies these ideas would be relevant, whether a particular story subscribes to them or not. This is often particularly with heroes like Iron Man and Batman, who don't have powers and sort of created their heroic identities through their wealth. It's often a criticism that they're basically fascist or feudal, perhaps, is the better word for Batman. I've heard that word used, too, since he's basically like a lord watching over his little fiefdom. But this idea that superheroes are just, these hyper-idealized, ubermensch, all-around great people who are just so much better than everyone else, so they get to be above the law and make all the decisions. And some stories really seem to buy into this idea. Some of them seem to go out of the way to try and deconstruct them. And I think to see where kind of the spectrum lies, I think this movie and Watchmen actually make great counterpoints because they have very similar premises in that they're both about superheroes, superpowered people, some sort of, again, exceptional individuals who have a brief golden period where they're allowed to do basically whatever they want and the public loves them until things turn sour and the government legislates them out of existence and the heroes are forced to return to their lives or go into hiding. Watchmen, being written as it is by Alan Moore,
a crazy hippie.
I was gonna say, the most cynical hippie, anarchist who probably ever worked in comics. Alan Moore's Watchmen was firmly anti Randian. All of these costumed heroes turned out to be psychopaths with hang-ups who shouldn't be in charge of a Walmart shift, let alone the fate of an entire city. And then on the other hand, you have The Incredibles, where the movie, I think the best scene in the movie is the one that always gets pointed to is at the end, where Syndrome is kind of monologuing before he sets his grand plan into motion to stage this false flag operation with these robots to make himself look like a hero, where he repeats, kind of calls back to a line that Dash said to his mom earlier about, when everyone is special, nobody is special. And that's sort of the last gotcha to Syndrome's evil plan, is that he's not only going to make himself look like a great hero, he's going to sell all of his tech so that everyone can be elevated to the level of these superheroes, which is a weird gotcha for... And I think this is it's the line that gets people sort of thinking, like, wait a minute, because why would everyone being on equal footing be a bad thing? And I know that this is coming from Syndrome, who will, like, be profiting all this or whatever, but, like, that idea, when everyone is special, nobody is, that doesn't seem like such a villainous idea to me.
Yeah, it's really not until you kind of take a look at the two sides where the idea stems from, how it plays off the opposite idea behind it. Because coming from it from Bird's perspective, and specifically like a Randian perspective, having everyone be special basically lowers the status of those who are essentially given via God these unalienable rights to be the best there ever was, to guide the forces of society and whatnot. So, like, to elevate everyone to that point would just basically mitigate everything that they had not even earned, but had been given, so they wouldn't be special anymore, and no one can be anything. I clearly don't subscribe to this theory, so, like, I'm not being very eloquent in my explanation as to why it would be viewed as a negative from that perspective. But, like, that's the basic gist of it, is, everyone's special, no one's special, those who were special no longer are, and thus can no longer lead in the way that need to be led. Meanwhile, if you are in the idea that everyone should be more equal, a la the socialist side of things, and not necessarily even, but, like, that's a gross oversimplification that might resonate on a more understandable level. The idea of everyone being equal is a much more palatable idea, where there isn't some supreme leader guiding the masses. It's no longer a dictatorship led by the special.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the idea that this is a gift, that these certain people are gifted, because I think that's a bit of a bit of a struggle in sort of the objectivist worldview, because as far as, like, Ayn Rand herself, having fled from communist Russia, I believe, and that's sort of why her beliefs are so extreme capitalist, just from having that background. What's interesting to me is that it feels like, with the objectivist mindset, there's both the element of kind of the classical, like, self-made man, like someone who earns their keep, like, they're contributing a lot to society, and that's what makes them great. I'm not familiar enough with, like, the details to say comfortably, but I feel like this is where, like, objectivism might start to diverge a little bit with hard, like, fascism, because there seems to be a difference to me, because it's sort of implicit in objectivism that, like, the people who are going to rise are going to be the ones who are gifted, but superhero movies are all about people who are naturally gifted in one way or another. Like, Superman didn't have to work for being Superman, he just is, which is why, even though that the ethos, the philosophies of objectivism seem incompatible with that of Superman, that's how they manage to still creep into something like Man of Steel or Batman vs. Superman.
Another Randian director we should mention.
Yeah, you can see how the idea would appeal to someone who is interested or sympathetic to kind of these Randian ideals. So I think that's just an interesting distinction, bringing it back to The Incredibles, just because that's one of the weird things about the movie to me, is the villain, Syndrome, is very clearly supposed to be this ineffectual, like, to a degree at least, like he's rich and made all these great machines, but it's not just like a scenario where he's got a rich like father and like an R&D department in his back. Like, we see him when he's a 12-year-old and he's following Mr. Incredible around, being annoying, kind of his like Start of Darkness moment. For just an annoying little kid, he does some pretty impressive things, like make fully functioning rocket boots.
And we see the apartment he lives in, and it's like not big. Like, you get a quick shot of his room, and it's a relatively small room, not implying that he's living in some fancy mansion in upstate New York or anything like that. It seems to be very humble beginnings. And even his wealth later on is all very explicitly stated to be self-made. There's references throughout of him spending the time and selling his goods to earn this wealth. Like, this is the idea of Randian politics right there. It's a man who rises above his station through capitalism at its core. Like, he is the uber capitalist.
And this is where the movie, I think, starts to, I don't want to say lose its focus, but maybe lose some of that thematic clarity, because we know that the movie isn't critical of these objectivist ideas, because Mr. Incredible is all about, like, being special and being great, and he misses when he was great, and he hates being another cog in the machine, and he turns out when his, like, shitty boss starts, like, yelling at him, and, like, you know, we're supposed to think that Mr. Incredible is maybe a bit of like, a absent father, and, like, maybe too caught up in his past, but the movie never gives us any reason to think that we're not supposed to be on his side when he's saying that, like, Dash should go out for sports because he is talented. And, like, I mean, he basically gives one of those baby boomer think pieces about participation trophies, like, in the middle of the movie.
Yeah, that was a wild thing to hear all of a sudden. I, like, do not remember that being in there. And, like, this was before the idea of participation trophies even came around. Like, this is an early movie, so I'm like, wow, that was a wild thing to hear all of a sudden.
Yeah, so the movie is very clearly sympathetic to this. So we're not supposed to be critical of Syndrome for this, I don't think. What we're supposed to be critical for him, though, is still, despite somehow being a self-made man with all this great talent for, like, tech, who can, you know, eliminate all the supers and basically be Iron Man. Despite all this, when he goes to launch his false flag operation and be a big hero, it just immediately, like, falls flat in his face. And, you know, we want to tie this all back into death. It's represented perfectly by his death. He dies in, like, the most, like, ineffectual, like...
it's pathetic.
Pathetic and also horrible way to go out. Like, you know, it's presented, we see the, with the famous, like, no capes, like, monologue from Edna, that, like, the cape is hubris and stupidity, like, personified in a hero. And so he gets sucked into the jet engine, and it's just a laughable way for him to go, especially considering he just completely lost control of his own machine instantly. So Syndrome is a self-made man who really is more, like, classically Randian than, like, any of the Incredibles are themselves. Like, if you think of, like, the Fountainhead, or, I mean, which one is it about the, like, railroads? I mean, it's one of those books. They're all about the same thing. But, like, you know, the idea of, like, this man who builds great things, which he very clearly does. This is kind of the great paradox of Syndrome, is that, you know, despite being the embodiment of these ideals in a lot of ways, he still, he just doesn't have the gift. Like, he still just doesn't have that common sense or the willpower or whatever it is, which somehow feels even more sinister, to me. Like now that I'm thinking about it, like, I think that's where the idea of the superhero and like being genetically gifted or whatever way, like I think that's where it starts to get uncomfortable. Like, because it's not just like, you know, the capitalist rising above everyone else through like sheer force of will. It's, well, you know, either you won the genetic lottery or you didn't, and you're smart and you're great, or you're not. And clearly, Syndrome was destined to die by jet turbine just because he was not one of the chosen Incredibles.
And yet he was incredible unto his own right. We indicated that he, you know, grew up as a child making wild jet boots and stuff like that. There's a very simple argument to be made that he was in fact a super. Like he was super intelligent or something like that, and it just didn't show. And because he was whiny and hanging on the cape of Mr. Incredible, he didn't get that recognition. And like I is there something to do with that, like in that style of politic where like if you are clinging to the capes of your heroes, you are somehow less or something like that? Like that's the only way I can see him being not equivalent to Mr. Incredible, because he functionally is, between his prowess as a capitalist, his ability to develop things, he's a wildly successful individual who should have every right to shape the future according to these politics.
Well, not only is he just wildly successful, but even if we're going with his fatal flaw is that he's a hanger-on and like too much of a leech, because that seems to go right along with kind of this line of thinking, like, you know, we don't like leeches. Oh my god. You know, perfect example. If you've never heard of objectivism, which if you're listening to this podcast, I doubt that's the case, but if you haven't, Andrew Ryan from BioShock, think of him in his monologues about like the leeches and the parasites, you know, building off this great city that he, the mighty industrialist, built.
No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the government. All that shit.
Yes. But yeah, so that definitely seems to track along with that. But the problem with that is Syndrome's fatal flaw is that it's not. I mean, he's obviously still obsessed with the supers because he kind of murders them all, or like tries to murder them all. But he also outdoes them. Like he rises above his heroes. He rises above like the great men of history. So does that not, by Randian standards, make him the greatest man of all? And so this is just where it's when you really look into the details of this kind of stuff. Because like that, when you look at Syndrome, it's not even that I think Syndrome's a bad villain. Syndrome's great. He's got a lot of great dialogue. He's got a goofy, wacky design.
He's relatively understandable as far as his initial, like, why he turned to villainy type of deal.
Motivations are clear. It's funny. It really works in the context. And yet, when we get the, you know, singular, almighty, like, hero narrative that he's so obsessed with, he's really not that different from Mr. Incredible. And really what seems to be the only difference is that, you know, Mr. Incredible, he has the chance when he thinks that his whole family is dead, and he's kind of reduced to his lowest point when he's captured, and he, I don't remember her name, but he, you know, in a surprise move, like, grabs the Mirage, yeah. He grabs her and, like, threatens Syndrome, like, that, like, I'm gonna break her, it'll be as easy as breaking a toothpick, and then he doesn't. I
was gonna say, maybe Syndrome's thing is that, like, he kills people and they don't, and then I just remembered that, like, this movie is just slaughtering Syndrome's mooks. Like, it's killing people.
Children killing people oftentimes.
Oh, yeah.
Fact. Yeah, Violet and Dash get in on it too. It's not just Mr. and Mrs. Incredible. Oh no. Yeah, I know. I was thinking the exact same thing. Is that we don't have that excuse of these being like drones, like Ultron robots, or like the Chitauri, or whatever stupid mook that shows up. Like, these are dudes.
We see their faces as they die.
We see their faces. They like hang out in evil minion vans and like take shots while they watch the plan unfold.
That
like
was I have to talk about that really quick, because I had no idea that line was in this movie. Because you're right. At one point, they're just sitting in this random fucking van in a hangar, which is funny on its own right. But like, if you listen as Mr. Incredible walks up to you, you hear him say something like, "Every time you take a shot," and like, A, they're talking about taking shots, and B, it has to be something horrible. Like, every time someone gets crushed, take a shot or some shit like that. And it is dark.
In the eyes of our glorious director Brad Bird, it doesn't matter, because they're just the sheeple, fam. And that was maybe a little too far, because I don't think he's ever like come out and like stated, like, he seems like a nice enough guy. So this is mostly a jest, but it's definitely, when you look at superhero movies, like, this sort of stuff is what critics are kind of talking about when they talk about maybe some of the inherent, like, skeeviness of the genre, you know? Like, whether it's there by accident or not, it's there. We got super children murdering minions who don't matter just because we say so, basically. And like, the minions, they're just there for a paycheck. I mean, you know, they're complicit in Syndrome's crimes, sure.
I'm trying really hard to find a way to slot in the DreamWorks minions every time you're saying minions, and I'm having a really hard time with that right now. And I'm really upset that I can't come up with a good way of doing it.
Well, if they were the DreamWorks minions, then the Incredibles would be completely justified in slaughtering them.
Oh, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's not the argument here. The argument here is, how do you segue that in without being like, and then there's the DreamWorks minions who are yellow and go banana a lot, because like that's not a joke. That's just a Ready Player One. I remember.
You beat me to it. So what else we got going on in this movie aside from Ayn Rand? Because that, I think that I want to say that mostly covers it for the Ayn Rand stuff. There's some little things in the family dynamic that bother me that I won't harp on too much, because it's not that big of an issue. But the way that it's set up, each of the four members of the family kind of has their own little arc, but they're kind of paired off in like their starting positions versus their ending positions. And it feels like they're kind of set to me to kind of implicitly meet in the middle of this kind of divide in their family, though I'm not really sure. It's not really set up like a divide, but that's just sort of how it ends up playing out to me.
I'm gonna like kind of dive into that a little bit, because like I see a little bit where you're coming from, but I don't necessarily know that the arcs in this movie have never bothered me. Like, I never thought like, wow, that's kind of weird that they ended up in X position. Like, it's always kind of, it felt solidly conclusive.
Yeah, so basically what we have going on here is that we have Mr. Incredible and Dash, who are kind of pro using your powers, pro let's show how much greater we are than everyone else, and then Elastigirl and Violet, who are kind of in the let's just live a quiet life camp. And Mr. Incredible's arc is pretty obvious. We have him, pining for the good old days, and like it's affecting his performance at his job, and like he's not really paying as much attention to his family as he should be. And then through this connection, through like recognizing how important they are to him, like he kind of comes back down to earth a little bit. So that tracks. And then Violet 2 seems to have kind of the second clearest arc to me, in that, she starts off shy, like shrinking Violet, and then, doesn't want anything to do with her powers, like, she feels like she's weird because of them, and then by the end of the movie, she's, like, confident, she's, like, asking out the boys, and, like, as a result of her, like, accepting herself, like, that tracks too. And so then we have Elastigirl, and the problem with Elastigirl's arc to me is that while it's pretty clear on paper that, like, it's about her being more flexible again, and, like, learning to cut loose and, like, maybe dip into the, like, super heroic side that Mr. Incredible is still really attached to without getting obsessed with it. But the problem with that as an arc for me is just that there's never a starting point for her, really, because the arc isn't, her using her powers isn't filling some kind of hole that she has in her life. Just from the way that the movie plays out, as I see it, we see Helen starting off, she's being a mom, she's being a good mom, a responsible mom, seems pretty content with the way her life's going mostly, and then the usage of her powers is not really, like, coming out of her shell like it is for Violet, but just something brought on kind of entirely by necessity, because Bob gets them into trouble, and then she has to kind of bail him out and protect the kids using the powers. So really, Elastigirl was just right and competent the whole time. And then Dash is where, I think that kind of the syndrome question starts seeping into the family dynamics, which otherwise I think balance off each other really good, because Dash, the whole thing with Dash is that he wants to use his powers, he wants to be a trickster, he wants to go out and play the sports, and, his parents won't let him. They're making him be ordinary. And, the question I have, like, as an adult now, is that if you're Dash, and you are so much obviously better at everyone else than, like, racing, so that if you were on the track team, you would just smoke everyone every time, wouldn't that not be fun? Like, wouldn't it not even be fun to compete because it wouldn't even be a contest? And if it would be fun, isn't that a little bit mean-spirited?
So, I think there's kind of... I'm going to take this... the first two, obviously, Mission Incredible has a solid arc. Violet has an arc that's pretty clearly explained. I think the question on Mrs. Incredible is... does she, and this is cynical and a little, I mean, plain and simple, it is almost, it's kind of sexist on the part of the film, in that, does she need an arc? Because, I mean, the movie is clearly about Bob more than anyone. He is the protagonist, and as a supporting character in his story, is she required to have an arc? Like, there's nothing wrong with having a static character as long as she plays off the others and shows their growth. So I'm just wondering if her not having a character would necessarily be a big deal. And before you answer that, let me talk about Dash for a hot second, because I'm just going to say, it's super possible that this is the first time that he's doing track, and he might just want to see what it's like, and it might just be that he needs a team dynamic to it. Like, there's an argument to be made that his decision to go out for track and sports and whatnot is not one out of malice or even, like, not having fun, but more to have that dynamic with other people, to be able to make new friends in that way. And even if it ends up being that, hey, I'm not having fun because I know I can win or something like that, there's a solid chance that this is his first track meet. Like, it's never explicitly stated how far into the future this is, but, like, you kind of get the sense that it's not very far off. So, I guess is my thought on Dash. And he kind of falls into the same category of Helen of, does he need an arc?
I think it's a good question. And we'll set Elastigirl aside now for just a second, because I think Dash being kind of the smaller role, I think, is easier to answer. Just because I think it's less that I think that Dash is like mean-spirited or nasty or like overly competitive or like doesn't care about people. He just wants to, use his powers and have some fun. He's a kid, and but I guess what I'm wondering is just that within the context of everyone else's sort of arc, and like whether Bob learning humility or whether the other characters learn to express themselves, those are the things that seem to clash a little bit, because that's sort of Bob's adventures are presented very clearly as like a midlife crisis, and that's one of the things the film does really well, is that it takes this superhero mission and puts it in the context of like how it affects their family, and how Elastigirl like starts to think that like maybe he's like having an affair, and like puts it in a very realistic domestic context that works really well. So for Dash, it just like, to me, it just seemed that the more natural, I guess I would just was hoping for something like as you said, there are plenty of reasons that aside from just winning that, he might want to be part of a team. But the scene that we get with him during the track meet, although it is very funny, still seems to like kind of highlight that problem, because they're like, oh wait, do great, but like not that great, like second place is fine. And that's sort of the scene that made me think like, well, why would this even be fun for him in the first place?
And that's where you get a participation trophy.
Exactly. And regarding Elastigirl though, I would argue that I think the film is trying to set her up for some sort of arc, and maybe doesn't give her, regarding kind of the specter of sexism. It's a little unavoidable considering with the whole like 50s aesthetic going on, and how she's kind of playing like a traditional housewife role. Like that's always, that tends to be some dicey territory for a male filmmaker to try and navigate without, bumping into some sexist tropes here and there. And really, I don't think that she's at all a bad character. I think the film was actually going out of its way to try and give her a lot of screen time and make her at least the secondary protagonist, which is why I think, and again, with the focus on the family, with the focus on their marriage, there maybe needs to be a bit more of a clear through line for her. Maybe a bit, I'd say a bit more of a desire, an expressed desire on her part. But the problem is that her desire is pretty clearly stated, which is just kind of like keeping the status quo. Like she doesn't seem that unhappy about it, which does kind of put her like on the defensive, but then she ends up being kind of right, but not really.
It might be one of those things where, honest to God, more than a second protagonist, she ends up being more of a foil to Bob. Because I think she does kind of play off his opposites in a lot of ways. So it could be that like she doesn't get that arc because she is just supposed to be his foil, representative, and a mirror to see how he has changed over the course of the movie.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely part of the intent. But for me, it's the scene in the plane. It's the scene where after she's kind of gone and like scolded Edna for giving Bob the suit and like finding out about this conspiracy, it's where she goes, because up until now, aside from the intro where we see her in her superhero heyday, she's kind of in full mom mode the whole movie. Like her powers have been used to like manage the household and like do some funny visual gags. But like there's a very sudden shift where she goes back into full like time for business, like calling out like commands and doing like fancy flying tricks. Like she's just like immediately jumping into an old habit. Which I guess I guess all I'm saying is it would have been nice if like the movie had given her a little more a space, like just kind of a beat to like really let some sort of like conflict show, like give the character some focus on whether or not slipping back into this role is like a good thing for her or not. It just feels like she's just able to turn on a dime without that much focus.
Well, I will say that she is, from what I can tell, the main character of The Incredibles 2, so that might be where this kind of comes more into conflict for her, because like The Incredibles 2 might be where she takes on far more of that character arc role, and Bob ends up playing more of the foil in that one, and you know, it might just be a big role reversal and exploring some new ideas based on their characters and whatnot. So I guess it, and to God, like, it was clearly trying to set up itself for a sequel back then. So like maybe the idea was even back then to have the first episode be more about Bob and have the sequel be more about Helen and their own individual arcs and changes throughout. So I don't know. I guess we should mention that we have basically recorded this episode because Incredibles 2 is coming out in 2 weeks, and we are very excited to watch and talk about that one. The only reason we're not recording it next week is because, like, every movie that we've been waiting to talk about is coming out next week. Let's segue to the end here a little bit and talk about what we're doing next week, talk about ourselves, talk about what we got coming up.
Talk about our feelings, talk about our hopes and our dreams, get our own character arc going.
I'm Sean McKinda. I was given participation awards since I was about 2. This has left me feeling deeply inadequate and constantly worried that I am underperforming at every facility that I have ever tried to do anything with. So I blame myself because I am the millennial who, as a 2-year-old, received it. If you would like to go and laud me with participation trophies, you can go check out my website, isortof.com. You can see my Twitch stream while you're over there. It's twitch.tv/helpless_skippy. I stream pretty frequently. Go check it out. I will say that the week of Incredibles 2 release, I think we're going to be doing another Read 'em and Weep, which is to say I'm going to be playing the Incredibles video game for the PS2 while I have some of my co-hosts come on and do a live reading of the script of the first Incredibles. So come around for that.
And I am Jackson Keller. I was given more Most Improved trophies when I was a kid, less participation trophies. I don't know if that's a worthy distinction to make, but I remember getting them because I would be really shitty on the basketball team at the start, and then by the end of the year, I would still be shitty, but slightly less so. I'd go from not even being able to hit the rim with the ball to having scored a basket during a game. And so it's still, I'm sure that in the eyes of our glorious overlord, Mr. Incredible, I'm still a weak flesh bag. However, maybe there's some room for me to grow yet to the levels of Syndrome, only to fall by dying in the lamest way imaginable. You can find me over at Jackson J. Keller on Twitter, where I am old Jackson now because I've decided that I'm very tired.
Coming back to that millennial theming, we got to shake that, It's bad branding. It's bad SEO. It's bad mojo. As always, we'd like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternate Take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. Go check them out. You can find them on Spotify, amongst many other places. They're a pretty great band, and they're cool enough to let us hang out. If you want to also check out 25yearslatersite.com, they're still kind enough to host us, even though we ranted about Randy and politics for 30 minutes or something like that, and it feels like a risky gamble at this point. Next week, we don't actually know what we'll be talking about yet. We're going to go watch Hereditary and Hotel Artemis and kind of debate which one will have more merit to talk about. So I guess if you want to keep up with us, go watch both. They're supposed to both be incredible from everything I've seen. Pun not intended. Any closing remarks, Jackson?
Have an incredible day, everyone.